Okay, I think we'll start. People are still streaming in, but we have a good number of people coming in already. We'll start on time. Welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Derek Now. I'm the director of the Center, CHK Center for Bioethics in Chinese University of Hong Kong. Welcome everyone and thank you for attending this seminar on artificial intelligence in future healthcare, considering the moral dimensions. This is actually the first of a series of 3 seminars on this theme, exploring the ethical, professional, and social issues of AI and digital medicine in healthcare. We are very pleased and actually very honored to have Dr. Sarah Chen from Edinburgh, Professor Rob Sparrow from Melbourne as our speakers, and Professor Daniel Chai from Taiwan, and Dr. Daniel Tiga from Munich, contributing as discussants. So rather than starting the seminar with an elaborate introduction on how AI may be transforming how we practice medicine in the future, let me directly get into the introduction of the speakers and invite them to speak in turn. Okay, each speaker, as a reminder, will present for 30 minutes. I've asked my assistant Joey to alert them and myself 3 minutes before time. We intend to keep time quite sharply if possible. And with that, we will then have comments by the discussants and also some time left for Q&A. Okay, so let me introduce our first speaker today. Dr. Sarah Chen is a leader in bioethics in the Usher Institute in University of Edinburgh. She is currently a deputy director of the Mason Institute for Medicine, Life Sciences and Law, and also associate director of the Center for Biomedicine, Self and Society. Sarah's research focuses on the ethics of new biomedical technologies, including gene therapy, genetic modification, stem cell, embryo research, reproductive medicine, synthetic biology, and also human and animal enhancement. Her work actually then ramifies into population health and also genetic data research and other areas. For interest of time, I won't actually read out the whole CV. Dr. Chen is going to speak to us on the topic of "To Err is Human: Effective Dimensions of AI in the Clinic." So Sarah, time to you.
So thank you very much, Derek, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be part of this very exciting seminar. So I'm going to just jump right into it. What I want to talk about today is what we may see happen as we start to introduce artificial intelligence and robotic technologies into the clinic. And, oops, I advance my slides. So what I'm going to explore is the ways in which the introduction of AI and robotics, and I'm thinking about these 2 broad areas of technology together, although I realize they're not identical. Thinking about the ways in which bringing AI and robots into health and social care can introduce new elements to our care relationships. What I will argue is that AI and that robotics can actually play a number of important roles in our moral narratives around healthcare delivery and health outcomes. And when I say our moral narratives, I mean the stories that we construct for ourselves around what's happening to us as patients in healthcare, the decisions that we make on our own in conjunction with doctors, in conjunction with AI, what the outcomes of those decisions are and who bears responsibility for these. The tentative conclusion, which I suppose it's not especially non-obvious, is that the effective dimensions of AI, so I mean here how we respond to robots and their affect, our responses to them as physical, embodied, emotional or emotion-provoking entities, are likely to be a significant part of how they intervene in our care relationships, and that therefore in thinking about the design of AI and robotic technologies, we need to attend to these effective elements. So Artificial intelligence is one of a suite of new technologies that have been heralded as potentially having a transformative effect on healthcare. And the ways in which AI is imagined as transforming healthcare happens in multiple ways. The first of these is through what we might think of as the conventional use of AI. So machine learning, the use of algorithmic prediction, using large learning data sets in order to achieve more accurate predictive medicine, in order to reach diagnoses, drawing on wider data sets or in more accurate ways, and even to provide recommendations for personalized treatment. So this is the big data side of artificial intelligence in healthcare. There's also the possibility that we might use artificial intelligence as part of the drug discovery process, for example, in computer modeling of potential new treatments. And yet another application of AI in healthcare is that of health systems optimization. So using machine learning and algorithms, for example, to predict demand on healthcare systems in order to be able to allocate resources effectively. So that's, if you like, the back end, the data-driven side of AI. But there's also a front end, what we might think of as patient-facing applications. So how will we as patients within the healthcare system be interacting with AI? And that might come, again, in a number of ways. Firstly, through medical devices and wearables, such as the Apple smartwatch. So a recent development in AI that was noted as, I suppose, an example of how wearables could contribute to AI-assisted healthcare was the ability of wearable devices to monitor cardiac health and perhaps to predict cardiac events. We might also start to see the advent of robots or AI on the front line. So whether that be robots as carers to help with manual tasks such as lifting patients, to provide care where there's a lack of human resources to address shortfalls in qualified carers. Whether robots might, for example, assist surgery, so to perform more precise and more accurate surgeries than a human surgeon alone could achieve, or even robots or AI as providers of primary care. So Babylon Health is an example in the UK recently, where patients are able to sign up to have an artificial intelligence available to consult online as their first-line primary care provider rather than their GP. And I've included telemedicine here, not because telemedicine necessarily involves AI. So telemedicine is any form of healthcare where the healthcare provider and the patient communicate through remote technologies, such as consulting your GP or NHS director over the phone, to more sophisticated forms. But because telemedicine involves patients interfacing with computerized or robotic or information technologies in ways that, again, I'm going to argue, might change the healthcare relationship and the ways in which we as people, doctors and patients relate to each other. Along with the rise of the technologies at the forefront of healthcare has come developments in the area of what's called social robotics. So robot imaginaries have, of course, been present in science fiction for a very long time, from Isaac Asimov's famous 3 laws of robotics to artificial intelligences such as the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and of course, a perfect example, I think, of a robot who stimulates what I would call an effective and emotional response is the animated character WALL-E. But social robots are no longer just the domain of science fiction. The field of social robotics examines the way in which robotics and robotic technologies can either be capable of, in themselves, what we might perceive as effective, embodied, and emotional responses. So even when robots themselves do not have emotions, they can still stimulate those responses or be perceived, indeed, to have those responses by human actors. And so the field of social robotics looks at the ways in which these new entities, these social robots, will integrate into, influence and alter human social interactions, and the factors which in turn shape the ways in which social robots are capable of doing that. So a further dimension for us to consider is the way in which social robots may integrate into healthcare and what the implications of this will be. One of the most pressing questions, I think, when it comes to the introduction of artificial intelligence into healthcare is how we should regard the decisions that are either made by or assisted by artificial intelligence. So, first of all, what happens if the AI gets it wrong? So what are the dimensions of not just legal but also moral responsibility for an AI that commits or an AI that assists in producing a medical error? And that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit about to begin with, and I know that Rob's also going to address in his talk what happens when we start to distribute responsibility not only for medical decisions but our broader healthcare decisions to artificial intelligences, either to assist us or to make decisions for us. So the first part of what I'm going to explore is, well, what happens when AI gets it wrong, and who's responsible and how should we regard that? But more recently, I've also started to think about the corollary question, which is what happens when the AI gets it right? What are the implications for health and social care as we get to the point where artificial intelligence begins to outperform human doctors? So when we discuss artificial intelligence, it's often talked about in terms of what's described as weak or narrow artificial intelligence versus strong or general artificial intelligence. Weak or narrow AI is, one example would be the chess-playing computers. So artificial intelligence that's directed at a very specific application. It can play chess, but it can't boil the kettle and make a cup of tea. It can't play 20 questions with you. So most of the AI, in fact, all of the AI that we have in the current state of technology is pretty much limited to weak artificial intelligence. Strong or general artificial intelligence, by contrast, would be an AI that really starts to think and maybe to behave like a human. So for an AI genuinely to exercise moral agency in the way that we understand humans as doing, we would need to be talking about strong or general artificial intelligence. So weak artificial intelligence, even though it may, for example, be able to steer a car, cannot make a decision with genuine moral agency about whether that car hits the one old age pensioner or 5 school children crossing the road. So both full-fledged artificial moral agents, or autonomous moral agents as they're sometimes called, and fully fledged robot doctors are still a long way off. So robots and artificial intelligence are not going to be taking over from human healthcare providers anytime soon. Nevertheless, however, I would argue that the way in which we perceive artificial intelligences and robots, especially in a healthcare context, is that they're going to enter into our narratives as moral actors. Even where we might recognize that they don't really have moral agency, they're going to start to play a part in the decisions that we make, in the way that we perceive them, and in the stories we tell ourselves about what's going on in healthcare. So the field of robotic psychology supports this idea that we as humans start to treat robots and AI as playing a moral part, even though we may know that with our brains that they aren't. Affectively and emotionally, we will start to perceive them as actors. So what's called the computers as social actors theory explores the ways in which we as humans treat robots and AI as social actors. Robots have also been described as participants in what Friedrich and Küster have called dyadic moral interactions. So where there is a moral agent on one side and a moral patient on the other, even where either the agent or patient may not be genuinely capable of moral agency in the sense that we've described, nevertheless, we start to see them as players in our moral interactions. In a healthcare setting, of course, we already have a dyadic moral interaction between healthcare provider and patients that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And so we might see robots or AI as inserting themselves into that relationship so that it's no longer dyadic between doctor and patient, but also now involves elements of AI. So the point here is that AI and social robots are going to be seen as actors within our moral narratives, and particularly around healthcare. So medical decisions, we need to recognise, are often moral decisions. And I mean this not just in the sense of, let's say, a doctor having to make a difficult moral decision about who should receive priority for treatment, or a difficult decision about ends or beginnings of life, such as we in bioethics are commonly used to. But then even fairly everyday moral medical decisions that are taken by patients in conjunction with their doctors and on their doctor's advice are morally salient, of course, because they involve health, well-being, sometimes life and death in terms of their consequences. But also the nature of the decision and the relationships that involves, I would argue, also have moral elements. So even where there's not a clear moral right and wrong, there are morally salient elements that characterise the doctor-patient relationship as a moral one. We can also see this in the sorts of standards that we expect of doctors. So medicine is an intrinsically moral profession. We expect that our doctors are, if not ideal, at least better moral agents. We hold doctors to a higher standard of ethical behaviour. So the doctor-patient relationship, I would suggest, involves a degree of what we might call delegated or substituted moral agency. Despite the idea that patients are idealised, completely independent, fully autonomous decision makers, we know that this is not really the case, and that in the doctor-patient relationship, there's a negotiation amongst the patient and the doctor. So when we consult doctors, we as patients are implicitly asking them, I would say, to assume some degree of moral responsibility for us. By consulting them on this important decision, by taking their advice, we are saying, please assume some of the responsibility for me and my care. And the sense in which that is delegated or substituted, I think, can be encapsulated in the question that we might often ask our doctors when we're not sure which decision to make. We would say, well, what would you do if you were me? What decision should I make? What would you do? So medical decisions then, I think, are a process of joint decision making between doctors and patients in the context of this shared moral agency. And so AI-assisted medicine can bring a third agent into that relationship. The way in which it does that and how that third agent is perceived is obviously going to depend very much on how AI is introduced. So doctors in consulting rooms right now are actually often relying on AI and algorithmic medicine, for example, to make a diagnosis, to prescribe a treatment. And when they're doing that, just sitting behind their computer screen, entering in information, that doesn't seem to alter the relationship very much. But what if the AI is physically present? What if there's, let's say, a robot present in the consultation? How might that change the relationship? Okay, let's talk about getting it wrong. So what happens when AIs are responsible for, in some sense, or involved with, perhaps I should say, a medical error? So we might want to know who is responsible, who we can hold responsible. And obviously one concern here is going to be about legal responsibility for medical error or medical negligence. So a way in which I was thinking about this question was to think about who's legally liable, and so the somewhat whimsical question of whether we should sue our robot doctors or whether it would be desirable for us to be able to sue our robot doctors. And here I'm following Tygard in thinking about what it is to have what he calls functional morality. So as I've said, AIs don't need to genuinely be moral agents in order to play this functional morality role and to be held responsible. And so I think we need to ask first whether there are reasons that we might want to attribute responsibility to AI in this way in a healthcare context. The basis for legal liability is the duty of care that doctors owe to their patients. But care is not only a legal, but also a moral concept. It has relational aspects. And so it's our ability to create relationships with AI or with robot doctors that can lead to both a perception of moral responsibility as well as expectations of care. So the question then becomes, what happens when those expectations are not met? What happens when the care relationship that we expect is not fulfilled? Now, as I said, an AI that can make a bad moral decision does not yet exist and is not likely to for some time. But that doesn't mean we might not want to still hold them responsible. We might still want to assign responsibility and say, well, the robot did it. Because part of responsibility is having someone to blame. And in this sense, we might see that there is some, when things go wrong, we want to be able to explain why they've gone wrong. We want the sort of satisfaction of creating a moral narrative that makes sense. Even when we know it's not rational or consistent to do so, we may know that the robot didn't do wrong on purpose. But there may still be some satisfaction in that. And this is borne out by, again, studies from the field of social robotics and robotic psychology that look at ways in which human actors respond to robots. So there might be the moral satisfaction, there might be the legal justifications as well of holding an entity responsible, of getting our own back, of retribution and satisfaction for that. Again, Dan Tygard's looked at blame in medical settings and the function that taking blame can serve. And so we might argue that robots that were able to take the blame, even if not to be genuinely morally responsible for the decision, might be able to serve a useful role in renegotiating care relationships between doctors and patients that have broken down as the result of medical error. Let me unpack a little bit more this idea about moral explanations. So explanations and explainability are seen to be important in AI. And indeed, the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI in its principles for trustworthy AI include, amongst the more familiar autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, include a fifth principle of explicability, which they describe as a combination of trustworthiness and explainability. Likewise, the General Data Protection Regulation in the UK includes the right to explanation, the right that when a decision is made about us by an algorithm, by an AI, we should be able to know on what basis that decision was made. So this is algorithmic explainability. But algorithmic reasons are not necessarily moral reasons. And so if we go looking for an explanatory role that robots might have as blame takers or as responsible agents within our moral narratives, we're going to need to look at what makes decisions morally understandable. Are robots able to play this role of supplying morally understandable explanations or reasons for the decisions? Or is this a role that only human doctors can play? In other words, is shared humanness a necessary part of making understandable or explainable moral decisions? And if so, what aspect of humanness is at stake here? So here's where I want to argue that embodiment is going to play an important role in the emergence of AI and robots as moral actors within our narratives. So what we call gut instincts. How can you trust your gut instinct if you are a robot who doesn't have a gut? So the basis of our trust in human doctors and human decisions is clearly their expertise, their learning, their long years of experience with patients. But this expertise is not only cognitive, it's also embodied and physical. So when a surgeon, for example, makes a decision about where to make the first incision, the doctor knows this not just with their head, not just with their brain, but also with their body and the tacit knowledge that is incorporated within their embodiment. Now, human doctors and human patients share these fundamental aspects. So, my doctor may be a man and I may be a woman, but we are still physically human, we're still embodied humans. And so I think there's a question about whether decisions made by AI or robot doctors might either be different because they are differently embodied, if we think that our embodiment somehow contributes to shaping our values, or, and I think this is more likely, that our perceptions of their different embodiment might lead us not to trust their decisions in the same way. So, if I'm trying to explain to my doctor my feeling of pain, how can a robot that doesn't sense pain have the same embodied understanding as a doctor does? Can I trust the AI to make decisions about me and my body and my pain in the same way? And so this, I think, has implications for the design of AI and for social robots that are used in care, if the way in which robots are embodied is likely to change our perception of the decisions they make and the extent to which we're likely to trust them. Okay, now let's talk about the other aspect, which is when AI gets it right. Can AI actually improve on human medicine? So when it comes to the use of, what I talked about as the back end, the use of big health data in predictive and personalised medicine, is it possible that we could use artificial intelligence, or could an artificial intelligence predict disease earlier? Could it be more accurate in its diagnoses? Could it be used to prescribe more effective treatments? We're already seeing, particularly in the area of what's called digital or computational pathology, that algorithmic analysis is beginning to outperform human pathologists in some areas. So being able, for example, to accurately diagnose cancer on the basis of digital slides, the algorithms that are being used here are now attaining as high, if not better, diagnosis rates than human pathologists. So what are the implications of the AI actually getting it right and doing better than humans? Well, it might be the case that some specific human roles in healthcare might become redundant. And there's an open question there about, if we make human pathologists redundant, who's going to do the human review of algorithmic decisions if we ever decide it's needed? If the human decision is usually worse, why would we want human review? It might also remove doctors' choice, or healthcare practitioners' choices about whether they want to use AI. So they might, for example, be found liable if they fail to use the gold standard when AI really gets that good. And again, these are changes to the practice of medicine of which we'll have to be aware. But ultimately, if AI is actually going to be better than human doctors, would you ever want your doctor to be wrong? Here's one example, of course, where your doctor being wrong might be a good thing. So about 2 years ago, in 2019, this case hit the headlines. A 78-year-old man was admitted to hospital and received a terminal diagnosis by a doctor on a video link robot. Now, it's important to note that this is a case of telemedicine. There was no AI or very little AI involved in this. I think the robot was self-mobile or could be guided. But this was a human doctor on the other end of the screen talking to the patient. And yet, the robot still has a presence in the narrative. So the daughter of the patient described it as saying, I look up and there's this robot at the door, and it's come to tell her dad that he's going to die. So the robot's present within the narrative, even though this is just a case of telemedicine. This case provoked quite a lot of reaction, mostly negative. I think most people had an instinctive, if you like, a gut reaction to the idea of being told by a robot rather than being told by a human doctor that you're going to die. And so that there is a question about whether this was just poorly managed communication on behalf of the hospital. Maybe they should have sent a human doctor to the room in person rather than sending a telemedicine robot. But the case got me thinking about what happens at that moment of communication of bad news, of terminal diagnoses, and again, the ways in which robots might change that, either for the worse, as it seems to be in this case, or for the better. And I think there are two main ways that show different aspects of the communicative relationship in which robots could either help or hinder the breaking of bad news. When you receive bad news, when you receive a terminal diagnosis, and I hope that none of you have been in a position to receive such bad news, but trying to imagine myself in that position, I guess my response would be, well, are you sure? Could it be a mistake? How might it be different to receive such a diagnosis from, let's say, an infallible AI? And now we know that AI is not infallible, that they can be wrong. But again, our perception that, well, the AI is better than the human doctor, the AI gets it right. Wouldn't you rather have the diagnosis from a human doctor who could be wrong? So there's a question about who should break bad news. And human doctors, not only through their affective responses, their emotional nature, but perhaps also their fallibility, might in some ways be better bringers of bad news. Their shared vulnerability through their embodiment, through their frailty, through their humanness, might make them more able to participate in and support our emotional responses to bad news. Further than that, the possibility of error, even if they're not wrong, the possibility that they could be wrong might permit us more narrative negotiation to come to terms with this bad news. And I'm thinking here of Jackie Leach Scully's concept of narrative vulnerability. How do we bridge that narratively vulnerable gap in our life when we realise that our life has suddenly taken a very different turn? Would the fallibility of human doctor give us more scope to negotiate, to come to terms with that? A robot, or an AI by contrast, could be designed to be effective, could be designed to be emotional. Would we want robots to be fallible? So the opposite side of this is that perhaps using robots to communicate bad news might actually be a better thing in cases where it allows for what we might term effective or emotional privacy. So another reaction to bad news might be, leave me alone, I just need to process this for a while. And maybe you actually don't want your human doctor in the room with you at that moment of ultimate vulnerability where you are reacting to this bad news. So there's an interesting study that was done a few years ago that used, this is on the left, Hanson, Robokind, Alice. And they used Hanson, Robokind, Alice versus the human doctor to break bad news to simulated patients. And they actually found, now the study's complicated, I admit I didn't understand all of the statistical analysis, and I think there are some methodological questions, including that these were, I think not, these were simulated patients. But they found that robots actually provoked more positive responses to the bringing of bad news than to human doctors. And they suggested that this might be because they allow for a degree of emotional privacy. So I'm not arguing on the basis of these two different ways of looking at things that robots are always better at breaking bad news or robots are always worse. But instead what I want to highlight is that there are various aspects of decision-making and communication, and AI and robotics can be used in different ways to mediate these. I see I'm at time, so it's hard for me to see my clock. So let me just offer a few concluding thoughts. The introduction of AI is reconfiguring the relationships that we have, including within the clinic. And this is a quote from a paper that I've just published with colleagues in, sorry, it's gone out of my head, this is terrible. A quote from a paper recently published with colleagues where we look at effective dimensions of AI and robotics. And we argue that not only are they rematerializing, we call it the boundaries of the human and the machine, but they're also changing the boundaries between what we understand as artificial, natural, rational, emotional, human, non-human, in ways that are changing human capabilities. The significance of human factors in medicine, I think, is not going to go away, even though AI is entering the clinic. And we need to think what it is we want from these human factors. Do we want a human element because we think machines are going to get it wrong, because machines are fallible? Do we want it because machines are not fallible enough, or they're perhaps going to be fallible in the wrong ways? And here, I think our starting to think about AIs as moral agents recalls some thinking about other sorts of moral agents that might be out there. For example, the prospect of posthumans. So Nick Agar has said about posthumans, their values would not be ours. Would artificial intelligences as moral agents, would their values be ours? What I've discussed today, I hope, highlights that we need to attend to the importance first of embodiment and of human or human-like embodiment in decisions, including the extent to which we perceive shared embodiment as a component of moral values. We need to contemplate the extent to which we see fallibility as human, perhaps intrinsically so. In discussions of moral enhancement, some people, so John Harris notably, has argued that fallibility is an essential part of human morality. We need to be free to fall, or we cannot be genuine moral agents. And I think that in turn prompts us to think about, is the right decision the one a human would have made, even where that decision might be the wrong one, if you like. We think about artificial intelligence as helping us to make better decisions, but what constitutes better? We have to contextualize the idea of what's a better moral decision in the context of our shared morality. And finally, AIs might also enable effective emotional and relational distance that can change care relationships, either for the worse or perhaps for the better. One final thought in favour of invulnerability. So over the last year, we've obviously seen a very very useful application of robots, which is in COVID care. So they're biologically invulnerable. They can't be infected. How will we negotiate the affective and emotional aspects of care relationships when biological invulnerability says we should use robot carers? So that's pretty much what I, as far as I've got with this work. I think the overall conclusion is that both narrative explainability and narrative adaptability in relation to the moral role of AIs relies very much on affective and embodied and relational dimensions of artificial intelligence. And through this, both robot doctors and health-related AI can also act not just as socio-technical imaginaries, but socio-ethical imaginaries that allow us to re-envision the values in healthcare and dissect out what is actually important to us. Thank you very much, and apologies for overrunning on the time.
Thank you, Sarah, for that very rich presentation. We'll certainly pick up on some of the points in the discussion and also the Q&A perhaps. But let me directly get into the introduction of the second speaker, Professor Rob Sparrow. Rob Sparrow is a professor in the philosophy program and chief investigator in the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence at the Monash University. He has been a visiting fellow for a very large number of universities, including Japan and also Hong Kong, including CHK, and elsewhere in Singapore. And he has published widely on the ethics of robotics, AI, and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. He is presently a co-chair of the IEEE Technical Committee on Robot Ethics and was one of the founding members of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. So let me invite Professor Sparrow to talk on the responsibility for healthcare outcomes in the age of medical AI. Rob, over to you, please.
Thank you, Derek, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to present today. I would like to thank Joey for her work in setting things up, and also say it's a pleasure to be subject to the no doubt searing criticism of the esteemed discussants, as well as to talk alongside Professor Chen. I'm going to cover a similar set of grounds in some way as Sarah has covered, although I think you'll see that my take on some of these questions might be quite different. In part, that's because I've been writing about use of robots in aged care for a long time, and I've also been centrally concerned in my work with this question of whether or not we can hold machines responsible. But for the most part today, what I'm interested in is the implications of the introduction of AI into medicine for the distribution of responsibility between human beings. And you'll see that I don't spend much time talking about the responsibility of machines. I'll explain why in a moment. I guess one of the presuppositions of this paper is that technologies are not just neutral tools, that technologies have what the science and technology scholars call affordances, which means that they are more useful in some roles than others. You know, hammers are good for hitting things, not so good for sewing or getting things out of small cracks, or, you know, playing a lute. The tools present themselves to us in ways that shape our behaviour. They foreground some questions, they force others into the background, they have a form of agency. And so I'm interested here in how introducing AI into medicine might create new choices for people. And when people face new choices, they become responsible for new things. AI is also likely to, now we can have new choices in at least two different ways. One way we can have a new choice is we have a new option in relation to a familiar question. So, for instance, the possibility of monitoring our patients all the time, for instance, which wearables now holds out. That changes the options available to clinicians. But there are also new questions that can arise. So, for instance, how to adjudicate the balance between false positives and false negatives in mHealth is, I will argue later in this presentation, very important and seems to be quite a new question. We can also find new choices because new context, the old choices appear in new contexts. And I'm not 100% on sort of the relationship between new contexts and new questions and new options. I was struggling to frame this, but it's clear, for instance, that turning medicine outside of the hospital into a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day business by using wearables raises a whole new set of questions, and the context of the subject or the patient out in the world living their life, and then we start to wonder, should we bring them in because the device is telling us that they might have a heart attack or their blood pressure is out of whack or whatever it is. They're a new context in which to confront a familiar set of questions, and that matters for responsibility as well. Related to new choices is also the idea of new choice architecture. So a choice architecture is different from a choice. It's the way in which choices present themselves to us. The order of the choices and the relative attractiveness of choices can change when we introduce a new technology. And I think we're going to see this very dramatically when it comes to the introduction of AI into medicine. We may have all of the old choices, though that's not clear. I should say one possibility here is that choices disappear as well, that we can actually lose choices, perhaps because we don't want to override the machine, for instance. But we can also experience new choice architectures where the presentation of the options, the relative attractiveness of the options changes once we have access to a new technology. We can also gain new information, and I think this is going to be a big part of thinking about medical AI. Doctors are already drowning in data in lots of contexts, and big data, wearables, AI threatens to flood individuals and organizations with lots of information. That also changes the choice architecture because people will end up ignoring, having to make choices about what they ignore. And sometimes with that new information comes changes in responsibility. We might get new actors in healthcare. Now, obviously, some people think the AI is an actor. I personally don't. But for instance, the role of engineers or the people who run communications networks, while they're not absolutely new in the context of AI, these are, I think, going to take on new importance in the future as our healthcare systems become ever more reliant on these new technologies. And we can also get new relationships. We can get relationships. One of the things I'm going to argue in a moment is that people are going to have a much more intimate relationship with corporations who are offering them health advice via medical AI. So we can get shifts in relationships. So new technologies, and in particular medical AI, can do all of that. Now here's my sort of, not especially well through, but it's an initial set of people who I think are playing an important role or will play an important role in the future of medicine. So on this slide, I'm using IBM the IBM logo to indicate the manufacturer or the provider of medical AI. We've got government, we've got the programmers, we've got clinicians, we've got the people providing the network that links all of this stuff together. We've also got hospitals and other medical organizations. We've got engineers. We've got the health insurers, who I think are going to play an increasing role. The more data we have and the more that data migrates or spreads into our daily lives through big data and wearables, the more the health insurers are going to be playing a role. And then we've got the individuals as well. So all of these people are potentially facing, people and organizations are potentially facing new choices as a result, and new choices, new choice architectures, gaining information, entering into new relationships with each other as a result of the introduction of AI into medicine. Notice that I haven't included the machine here. And that's because I'm skeptical of even the notion of pseudo-agency of machines. And so I don't think machines can genuinely be moral. Don't think they're moral agents. I don't think they're in the right sorts of relationships with us. I think we can blame a machine in the way that we can blame a broken shoelace or the weather. We can place them into explanatory stories, but the moment we start attributing moral responsibility to them, I think we're making a profound mistake. I also worry about relying on narratives that blame machines because of the potential for those narratives to obscure the moral responsibility of the human actors. So for the sake of this presentation, and I'm happy to defend it in discussion, although we may often think of it, in ordinary language, we might want to say the AI or the health app has become responsible. I'm always going to argue in favour of distributing that responsibility to either the programmer or the manufacturer or perhaps the regulator. And I imagine that might come up in discussion a bit more. All right. We also are going to have to, and this is, I think, a task for the future, is both to do more to distinguish between these different contexts in which questions about ethics and responsibility arise, but also to think each of them through. And I think at the moment the literature has suffered a little bit from not making these distinctions. So they're an important set of policy questions, and indeed part of what I'm going to argue today, or I'm arguing today, is that the introduction of more AI into medicine actually makes these policy questions more important because we are going to end up with more potential single points of failure, where one AI might be have replaced tens of thousands of physicians in diagnosing a particular condition. I think that makes policy much more important. There are the questions that Sarah has been foregrounding, which are largely in the context of the consultation. So the relationship between the patient and the physician may be mediated by the role of the AI. But there are also I think, neglected set of questions about the shift in responsibility and indeed ethical questions more generally that arise when we introduce AI into organizations. And we've seen with, for instance, digital medicine or electronic medical records, that this stuff isn't simple, that healthcare organizations are complicated beasts that are quite hard to change, and that when we do attempt to change something that we might think of as just being part of the administration, things can go badly wrong. People can be empowered, people can be disempowered, a whole new set of political and ethical questions can arise, or old questions can be reinvigorated. And I actually think that one of the places that medical AI is likely to play a role initially in medicine is in things like, scheduling both patients but also physicians, hospital billing, internal communications. There's a whole set of roles that people won't, they're roles for AI in medicine, but they're not necessarily point of care roles. And I think those are under-scrutinised. And there is a lot of potential for shifts of responsibility in that context. Finally, and this is something that I guess people have thought more in the context of mobile health or e-health, and perhaps big data, but clearly artificial intelligence plays a role here. There's the context of the individual as a consumer in relation to the manufacturer of a mobile health product or a AI digital carer. And what's interesting about that is it's quite a new context for healthcare. The idea that I could be in a morally significant relationship in which the distribution of responsibility is important 24/7, and that this is a field in which medicine is poorly regulated at the moment. And in particular, because it's not clear whether algorithms or AI, should be regulated as kind of treatments or devices or practitioners. There's a whole set of policy questions around how to think about that relationship between individuals, their health, and the provision of medical services through mobile devices that I think needs to be scrutinised much more carefully. And again, it is being scrutinised in debates about mHealth, but I think it also needs to be looked at in the context of debates about AI. I struggle to find the right word for this context. I've said market, but I did sort of wonder whether it was actually the consumer or whether it's daily life. Even conceptualizing this new context, I think is harder than first appears. But I certainly want to emphasize that these are all relationships as well, that in each of these new contexts, there are relationships that are going to shift as a result of the role of AI. So how might responsibility shift? Well, I think it's going to shift away from clinicians towards the machine, and then I quickly say not the machine, but towards the programmer or the manufacturer or the provider of the AI. So this kind of, these ominous blue buildings in the bottom right are now substituting for the IBM logo as a representation of the manufacturers of medical AI. It's also going to move in some sense away from individuals. And this is difficult because I also want to say in some ways, medical AI is likely to shift responsibility back towards individuals, but it will also problematize the ability of people to make decisions about their health, because they, like the clinicians, will end up feeling obligated to defer to the judgments of the medical AI. So we've got responsibility moving from the clinician and the individual towards the medical AI. I then think that should be distributed to the programmer. We should quickly say it's not really the machine that's responsible, it's the people who have programmed the machine, but the people who have programmed the machine are typically contracted to do so and directed to do so by the manufacturer. Now, there is a question about the role of policymakers, because I think it will be deeply problematic to allow the corporations that are building healthcare AI to assume ultimate responsibility for all the things that they are likely to end up causally responsible for. So I think there is going to be an increasing role for policy here and regulation. I think this is an area where it is desperately important to regulate, not least because the model of regulation that we currently use for relationship between people and their apps, for instance, which is a kind of opt-in, opt-out, click a few buttons on the screen model, is notoriously hopeless. And in high-stakes contexts, and healthcare can be a high-stake context, we need to be protecting consumers. I mean, even expressing this as being about consumers shows how problematic it is, because these people are patients and individuals as well. And to reduce them into consumers is already to have made a number of moves in a debate about responsibility. Now, the problem with the policy, with shifting all the responsibility to the policy makers, is the rhetoric of empowerment that is a big part of mHealth and of big data also works to insist that now that individuals, are being alerted by their phone every time they look at a packet of potato chips, or every time their blood sugar goes up, or they are caught puffing on a cigarette or drinking alcohol, some alert goes off, a record is entered into, a big chain of records. This implies that consumers are in some sense individuals are in some sense empowered. And, and there's a really dominant rhetoric of empowerment in the marketing and in the literature around mHealth and personal digital assistants. It's supposed to put you in control. But of course, if you're in control, you are also responsible. Now, I think that is, I think that's often going to, I do appreciate the power of the logic to say that if you're repeatedly being warned every time you engage in a behaviour that will contribute to your ill health, it's tempting to say that you are more responsible. But I also want to emphasise the relative powerlessness, when it comes down to it, of individuals in relation to the organisations that are manufacturing AI healthcare apps. It's very, very hard for people to judge the reliability of those systems and to make intelligent choices in relation to those systems, but also in relation to the environmental determinants of health, particularly at a population level. So much, and we've seen this with COVID, the reason why I haven't got COVID or haven't had COVID is very little to do with my individual behaviour and all to do with the public health context in which I'm fortunate enough to live. So the idea that we should hold individuals responsible for their, obesity or their drug use or their, relationship to an infectious disease is often, neglects all the public determinants of health that make it very hard for people to do that, particularly in contexts of existing social injustice. All right. Okay. Now I want to briefly discuss a question that also Sarah raised, which is this question of when the machines get better at medicine than we are. Now, I'm referring to cyborg medicine here because if you are manufacturing a medical AI, you need to sell it to hospitals in which clinicians play key decision-making roles. So if your sales pitch is this is better than you and it's going to do you out of a job, you've got a real rhetorical problem. You've also got a rhetorical problem if you say this isn't as good as you and it's going to make a whole lot of mistakes. So what people end up saying is the future of medicine is a future of shared engagement between human beings and machines. And this is the idea of cyborg medicine. And this has been sort of popularized and advocated very powerfully by Eric Topol in this book, Deep Medicine, where he envisages a future in which machines take care of all the kind of routine stuff and they help with diagnosis, but ultimately the human physician is in charge, working in collaboration with the machines. And I think this is a rhetorical sleight of hand, to be frank. I think there is much less space for shared responsibility between humans and machines than people think, because I think that there is this kind of horns of a dilemma in the given role. If the AI isn't better than the human, then we shouldn't use it. If it is better than the human, then we should defer to it. In fact, we shouldn't use human beings in that role at all. And I think this will start at the margins. I think we'll start in areas where labour is short. So, AI pathology will be offered to people who can't access human pathologists. But the more evidence we have that the machines do it better than we do, the less plausible it is to continue to have human beings play a meaningful role in decisions in this context. Now, even before, I must say, I'm actually deeply skeptical of a lot of the data about the performance of AI in medicine. People very seldom trial these machines in real-world clinical contexts. They usually do something like split a data set into two, train the machine on human judgment in one data set, or train it maybe without human judgment on one half of the data set, then unleash it on the other half of the data set and compare it to human performance there. But that neglects a whole series of complexities once we take these machines into the wild. So I don't think we're necessarily there yet where the machines are really better than us. But I do think that we are in a situation where patients and regulators may start to think that the machines are better than us in various ways. And then we have the risk of what I've called here cyber defensive medicine, defending yourself against criticism that you have overruled the machine. So I think we will actually move very quickly to quite widespread deference to algorithmic medicine, where people will mistrust their own judgment, they'll be vulnerable to automation bias, and they will have to cover themselves if they are going to overrule a machine, and so they will become increasingly reluctant to do so. Now, here's another shift of responsibility, and that's the vast concentration of power that I think and responsibility that will arise, particularly as mHealth and healthcare apps start to get better and better. We can imagine every citizen in Hong Kong being in a relationship with one manufacturer of the best product for a particular medical problem. And again, not only might these things be better than human beings, but whenever the machines are in competition with each other, there is going to be a compelling case that everybody should use the best machine. There's also a real role for network effects here, because your healthcare app gets better the more data you have, and you have more data if you have more users, so the thing snowballs, which means you get rapid monopolization of markets. This means that the manufacturers of these, the programmers and manufacturers of these healthcare apps, are arguably responsible for the healthcare outcomes of the use of those apps for every person using them. It also means that there is a single point of failure. So if the machine goes belly up, then a lot of people, if one doctor gets sick, a few patients might be in danger. But if, Google super AI computer gets sick, we're all in trouble. And there's also I should have mentioned the possibility of de-skilling earlier, that when we start to defer machines, we actually lose the capacity to overrule them because we lose the skill set that we originally used to use to make that judgment. And this is also a problem if everybody is handing over authority for some healthcare condition to a medical AI. There's a problem here with orphan diseases because the systems will work best for the common condition.
Rob, we have maybe 1 more minute.
Okay, no worries. All right. My timer gives me 2 more minutes, Derek, but I will. Okay. There's also this problem of what's called responsibilization, pushing responsibility back onto the individual consumer. So it's the reverse problem of the concentration, and I can talk more about that in discussion. Finally, it seems to me there's a real risk of perverse outcomes here. We can get massive overdiagnosis, particularly in the context of defensive medicine. Ambulances turning up because your healthcare app predicts that you might be having a heart attack, or you're about to have a heart attack. And I think it's going to be very hard for the manufacturers of these devices not to feel compelled to alert healthcare services to imminent crises, even if the data is a little bit unreliable. Also, the problem of de-skilling, the problem of the loss of a capacity to set our own ends in healthcare context as a result of reliance on these systems, and inevitably unintended increases in healthcare expenditure, particularly associated with overdiagnosis. I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion. I'll just mention, there's the paper. If people ask for the slides, that's the background set of papers that I'm relying on here. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much. Again, a very rich presentation, making some strong points about the sharing of responsibilities and whether the machine can be even a pseudo moral agent. I will pick up on some of those points in the discussion and Q&A, but let me first very quickly, I think, introduce two discussions in one go. I think to save time, to avoid interruption between the two discussions. Our first discussion, Professor Daniel Chai, is a professor in the Graduate Institute of Medical Education and Bioethics in the National Taiwan University College of Medicine. He is a family physician and a bioethicist, and he graduated in the National University College and earned his PhD in the University of Manchester in UK in 1999. He actually has a lot of active ethics roles in Taiwan, being the attending physician in the Department of Medical Research and also chairman of the Research Ethics Committee in the University Hospital. He is also formerly the vice president of the International Association of Bioethics and currently the president of the Taiwan Association of Institutional Review Boards. And our second discussion, Dr. Daniel, I say Tiga, there should be Tiger, Daniel?
Tigard, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I should have checked that before the seminar. Daniel Tigard is the Senior Research Associate in the Institute for History and Ethics of Medicine in the Technical University of Munich. He published works addresses topics in ethical theories, moral responsibility, application to issues of bioethics. More recently, he worked on the ethical issues in emerging technology, AI and robotics, and along with members of the Munich School of Robotics and Machine Intelligence and the Munich Center for Technology and Society, Dr. Tigard also works on the project Responsible Robotics, which aims to embed ethics into AI and robotic technologies, particularly for healthcare settings. I saw from his publications in the past, he also worked on the issues of errors, medical errors, and other issues. So this question of errors, responsibility is also something I think very familiar to Dr. Tigard. But let me first invite Professor Chai to make a few comments, observations on the discussions. I'm going to allow each discussion maybe 7 minutes and then leave some time for discussions and response. Okay, Professor Chai?
Yes, thank you, Direct. Is my voice clear?
Yes, very good.
Okay, great. Thank you for your kind invitation, and also thanks to the two presenters for your very rich, actually stimulating speeches. I enjoy a lot. At the very limited time, I firstly like to respond to Sarah's presentation. I have three thoughts, maybe for you to consider and for us to discuss. Firstly, is the distinction between the medical decision and the moral decision. Okay, we imagine that maybe at this stage of a weak AI, it will assist in diagnosis, in making decision, making treatment plan by this medical AI. But when we are making such kind of decisions, we actually must consider, for example, which one is the better treatment options. Is it surgery, chemotherapy, or we may choose palliative medicine? But in making such a decision, maybe it appears to be like the scientific ones, medical ones. It actually involves consideration of the individual concerns. For example, the patient's age, the patient's preferences, and the successful chance, and all these consideration. And taking another example, when we are making treatment choices, but it must consider triage. For example, in the COVID world, where we must choose whether to use a ventilator for some patient or others not to use that. Actually, all these medical decisions involves the moral dimension. So I would imagine that, yes, even this weak AI, hopefully someday it will be strong AI, this moral dimension of decision making must be included. So in other words, I think this AI must be trained. Robot must be trained ethically. Okay, so there, even the medical decision must include the moral dimension. So this will blur your proposal in making these decisions. But I think in the future it will be necessary. Okay, we will need our medical AI to have this moral consideration to incorporate what we mostly refer to the 4 bioethical principles in our decision makings. So this is the first point. And the second, about the explicability or the duty to explain. I think this is quite important. It is a legitimate requirement of patient ask for doctors because we want to have informed consent. We want to understand the situation so a patient can make decisions. And for this explicability, in terms of the medical AI, I think we will encounter one important concerns. For example, is the black box. Okay, we know that black box has been an important fact, but also a concern about we are using AI in all aspects of decision makings. For those very complex medical decisions, you involves not only considering the personal information, the individual situation, you must apply the big data, okay, the database, a different set of database to make decisions. So there is always some black box in it. So this will cast some doubt to the explicability. Taking the example of the breaking bad news. Okay, bad news is a very good example. Okay, if this AI is very strong, your paper referred to that it will leave very few space for this kind of fallibility or uncertainty. But I think if taking into consideration of this huge different set of database, the possibility of black box exists. So probably we can consider that even when we use AI for breaking bad news, there should be certain chance, certain space that because it could still go wrong, it could still be uncertain. So even we use AI for explaining this kind of disease situation, making decisions, if we consider this black box factor, there is still this fallibility or uncertainty that actually is within this application of AI. Okay, and thirdly, is the doctor-patient AI relationship. I think I agree with Professor Sparrow that this new technology will certainly impact these relationships, our decision-making immensely. So in this doctor-patient and AI three-party relationships, I think it will depend on how strong is our medical AI. Okay, for this weak medical AI, maybe AI in these three-party relationships, it will appear only like a medical assistant. Okay, like a medical device assisting our diagnosis. But if this AI become a strong AI, very powerful, the role of doctor might diminish. Just like in nowadays, lots of human labor has been replaced by machine, by automations. So this will happen the same at this doctor-patient AI three-party relationships. So this is one aspect if we consider the power of AI. But on the other hand, we may also consider the preference of this two-party. Okay, I mean the doctor and the patients. Patient may just simply prefer doctor to have interaction with him or her. Okay, he may want the AI to play less roles. So in this kind of requirement, even we have a strong AI, but I think in this doctor-patient relationship, the strong AI could still only play minor roles. But on the other hand, if doctor prefer not to interact with patient, okay, if this doctor is very is very shy in communication, he prefer to be a pathologist or a radiologist. He doesn't really want to interact with the patient more, and then this medical AI may play a stronger role in these three-party relationships. Even the patient demands, but however, the doctor might still try to remain a smaller role in these three-party relationships. So I believe that in the future, these three-party relationships will depend on the both side preferences. And this might be one kind of, when we began the new doctor-patient relationships, this kind of preferences must be considered. And the two parties must decide, okay, how much role we will allow the AI to play. And then we start to communicate. We start to have relationships. So I think I will have these thoughts. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here.
Oh, yeah, great. Okay. I was going to let both discussants to raise the comments before going back to the speakers. But I think in this sequence, it may actually work better for the audience to quickly now then let Sarah make some initial response to some of the comments. So while the questions and comments are fresh, Sarah, you want to say a few words about Professor Chen?
Yeah, yes, thank you very much for those insightful comments. I think particularly the way in which you describe medical decision-making as invoking these moral elements, to me, certainly adds to the argument that we need to be thinking about the role of AI as part of that moral process. So, for example, you talked about decisions involving not just the scientific or the biomedical, but moral values, for example. And I think a real question is going to be, when AIs start to come into that, to what extent can we, and to what extent will we? And I recognise, taking on board what Rob said about genuine moral agency, the extent to which they will be able to understand, weigh, and use moral values, and the extent to which we will be perceiving them as doing so are two different things. I think the point about explainability and embodiment. So just to build a little further on that, yes, absolutely, there are elements of any medical decision where you would expect the doctor to be able to lay out, here are all the reasons that I considered, and here's why I recommended this particular course of treatment for you. And in many cases, they will be based on percentages, statistics, your blood type, your personal genomics, the scientific information. But there will also be aspects of decision. So I gave the example of a surgeon, for example, making a decision about where to cut. Now, there will be technical knowledge involved in that, but some of it will also just be, I have the embodied knowledge of how to do this operation. And if you like, the reason itself, even for human doctors, can be a little bit of a black box. I decided this because this is me as a human surgeon making this decision. And again, what I'm trying to explore about embodiment and the way that it both shapes our embodied moral values and shapes our decisions, perhaps I can illustrate by referring to, so I referred to Isaac Asimov and his robot stories, but he also wrote a story called Eyes Do More Than See. And it's about a future in which humans no longer exist as embodied humans. We've uploaded our minds into machines and we've become these, if you like, computer intelligences. And these beings of the future, we can't call them humans, we maybe can't even call them post-humans, they don't have bodies anymore, but they remember that once they had things called eyes, and eyes were foreseeing, but the story ends with one of the characters remembering that eyes don't just see, they also cry, they also shed tears. And for me, that story has always captured what's so difficult to put our finger on about embodiment and how it relates to our moral values and what it is that we value. And I think that's going to be very difficult to program into an artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So may I now invite Dr. Daniel Tiger to make some comments and discuss some of the points in the presentations. Daniel.
Great, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine.
Great. I guess I'll start with a few thoughts I had with Sarah's presentation, then I'll move on to some thoughts for Rob's presentation. So I guess to begin, Sarah, I very much appreciate the intersections of moral psychology with applications to issues in bioethics, and so that's something I really appreciated your focus on the affective responses, the human responses that we just naturally have toward lots and lots of different things in the world, whether it's another human being, other sorts of animals, or perhaps even artificially intelligent beings. I think what that focus does is bring out the relationships that we may have, regardless of their agential status. So I like that move because it de-emphasizes the role of this, the hard properties for agency. It's just no longer as important when we're talking about responsibility as those natural relationships that we have with one another. I guess for that matter, I also want to say I very much appreciate the focus on what happens when AI gets it right. I think often the role of praise gets overlooked. We talk a lot about blame and all these negative responses we undergo, but there's a flip side to our natural human responses. Hopefully, maybe not so much in the world lately, but hopefully there's a positive human response to the world and to others of all sorts. A couple points that I was starting to draw a few question marks. When we're talking about how the doctors are normally the kind of the ideal moral agents, I guess what I'm starting to lose sight of a little bit is that they're still acting in non-ideal circumstances. And so that seems to already kind of undermine that idealization of their agency and the circumstances in which they're acting. And I think the same goes for when we're using artificially intelligent tools, right? There, again, we don't have to talk about their ideal or non-ideal agential status. We can just talk about the fact that they're acting in non-ideal circumstances. And so for that matter, I think there's still a very, very close relationship between the role of human doctors and the role of artificially intelligent systems in promoting our health. They're acting in very non-ideal circumstances. So in both cases, the agential status seems to be undermined a bit. So I actually think that could help you a bit, just to focus also on the circumstances and not just the ideal or non-ideal agential status. I do want to talk a little bit about the role of error and our responses to error. I think you're absolutely right. As you mentioned, I've written a little bit on this, and I do think taking responsibility can serve a very important function. Such things as helping people through loss, right? Like helping patients to understand either what went wrong or not even what went wrong, but just that there's someone there for them, right? Because it might be unclear what happened. Even in human cases, right? We get it wrong and it might be unclear exactly what happened. So I think just being there for patients and families of lost patients is a way of taking responsibility. And I think for that matter, we can appeal to things other than humans, but here there might be a bit of a problem with saying that, you know, there's a role for AI and advanced robotic systems that might invoke the same sorts of responses in us, because I think what I'm looking for is a way of stopping the chain, right? Because it looks like there might be a way of saying, well, look, a stuffed teddy bear or something like that might be able to serve that same sort of role. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that is a way of comforting people in a time of loss, right? I guess I'm just looking for a way of stopping that move, because it does seem like it might run into some problems there with how, you know, an inanimate teddy bear would be able to take responsibility in the same way as you know, something that is more animate, even if that is an artificially intelligent system. So I guess I'm looking for some way of stopping that move. But I guess the final point I wanted to make with for Sarah's presentation was I really like the role of narratives. For some philosophers writing about agency and responsibility, I'm thinking in particular of John Doris. Narrative plays a really big role, and I think this is also another thing that you could harness either here or elsewhere. I'm not sure so Doris and a few others are just really, really skeptical that we can have anything like this robust sort of agency that we all dream of. Like, you know, he thinks we rarely know the reasons that we ourselves are acting, right? So yeah, you might be already familiar with this. So I think that's another move that you might be able to harness, right? Like, you say that the robots are already in our narrative, whether it's, you know, breaking news or just a part of the medical system. So in some way, you know, it's going to be very, very different, but in some way they're already entering into our conversation. They're already entering into the reasons that we give for what happened. I see Rob starting to shake his head, so I should shift before my time is completely out. Do I still have a few minutes, Derek?
Sorry. I'll let this time I let Rob to come back to comment over the comments of Taiga just now on. It seems that you take a rather different position on whether one can easily take away the responsibility issue by any other means, whether by calling it a pseudo agent or whether by considering the affective and relational issues. At the end of the day, it seems that you are take it very seriously. You still need to assign the responsibilities to different parties other than machine. Did I read that correctly?
That is what I think. I mean, I'm not sure that I fully defended that here. I guess I understand that assigning responsibility can play other roles, particularly those kinds of healing roles or a role in narrative. What I worry about is how we reality check that. I mean, it came out in Daniel's worries about a teddy bear. I mean, people just have crazy ideas about robots and what they're capable of, and they respond emotionally to robots in ways that simply aren't justified in the context of anyone who knows what the machine is actually doing. The way beings respond to them is wrong-headed. Now, that may be good for people, but as I've argued elsewhere, that raises questions about the ethics of deception and manipulation and the role of the designer. And then I think to hold someone responsible, for instance, it must be conceivable that you should punish them, or not that you necessarily will punish them, but it's conceivable that they are that you would punish them and that would be appropriate. And I simply can't imagine what it would be, how someone could, for instance, be justified in feeling satisfied as a matter of natural justice because someone had turned down the electricity to the AI or hit the big red pain, the big punishment button on the robot. And then we say, well, now the robot has been punished, you should feel better. I just, for reasons related to my commitment to a sort of Wittgensteinian account of interpersonal relations, I just struggle to understand how we could ever be justified in saying of a robot that it was guilty or had been punished or that it felt remorse. Anyway, I mean, I shouldn't be responding to Daniel's criticisms of Sarah.
Sarah, you have anything to? I'll come back to you, Daniel. Sarah, you have any comments?
I'm aware we're quite short of time, and I think Daniel had a few more comments specifically to Rob, but I will just come back on the whether it's justified for someone to retaliate against a robot and say, well, have you never slammed the door on which you stubbed your toe or, kicked the rock that you tripped over and felt, no matter, maybe you're just you're a more perfect rational agent. I know there's nothing there to be punished, but it makes me feel a bit better. So I'll just leave that there. Okay,
I'll pass the time back to Tiger. Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a couple points. So a lot of my points are actually for both Sarah and Rob. So I guess I want to make a few similar points, but more directed at Rob. So I guess one of the questions I should take the opportunity to say I've appreciated reading and responding to some of your work. And a question that is always lingering, and I'll just put this out there for you. I'd love to hear your response. What is moral responsibility? It seemed like there was a bit of a shift when you start talking about the role of policy. This is actually a little bit of what came up a week or two ago with Mark Kuckelberg's group. It looks like policy to me is not necessarily moral responsibility, right? There we're assigning legal responsibility, other sorts of responsibility, right? So I'd be very interested in your thoughts on what exactly moral responsibility is. Oftentimes in the philosophical literature, I'm sure you're aware of this distinction. It's either something like a property, right? Something that we look for in individuals, and that way we can say these people or these things don't have it and these ones do. Or it's something like a process, right? A way of relating to others, the relationships, etc. And that route is more easy to assign more responsibility to things that aren't necessarily full-fledged moral agents, right? Because we stand in relations to them. So I guess I'd be curious as to your view on that distinction. When you speak about power, the companies having power, the governments, the individuals who are empowered to give their data, it looks like there is a way of stopping the teddy bear move, right? We can say, look, AI is extremely powerful. right? It knows things that we don't know, that lots of patients, practitioners, we just don't know. So if power is a way of assigning responsibility, it looks very easy, I think, to make that move to say, maybe in some sense, there is a way of holding, right, a process view, things that are not full-fledged moral agents responsible in virtue of the power that they have. So anyway, I'll stop there and open things up.
Rob, you want to quickly respond to that before I open the time to floor, or you want to wait?
No, I'll say something. I mean, I think this is important because in particular in relation to the institutions, I mean, just very briefly, I do think of responsibility as fundamentally a relationships of you know, healing, punishment, responsive attitudes. So I think this is about relationships, but I think that there are quite demanding criteria for the appropriate use of our language about those relationships. And I think a lot of the literature on robotics, particularly the human robotic interaction literature, fails to distinguish between an inverted commas punishment or inverted commas relationship and a real relationship. So yeah, I've kind of lashed out at inanimate objects when they've hurt me, but the sort of things that I would say about that response are very different from the sort of things that I would say about a case when I have lashed out at another human being. And so there's a whole set of conversations. I treated my partner unjustly when I blamed her for that, and I feel dreadful because of that. And it would be appropriate for me to make, an apology, for instance. And it's just when people start talking that talk about the robots and the AI, you can't tell the difference between real attribution and simulated attribution. I guess there's a deep-seated behaviorism in the way that people think about robots and AI, where they think the appearance is as good as the reality or the same as reality, and that's not how our ordinary moral language works. If I discover that your apology is false, for instance, that matters to me. I don't say it's as good as, because I found it compelling at the time, and that's all that matters. We care deeply about reality here, and so I do think that in a way that means that the properties of the machine start to come back into the argument, because when we look at what it can do and what its internal representations are, it's simply we've only ever got this kind of scare quote language. Now, the institutional questions, that's a philosophical discussion that I'm happy to continue at another day. I do think there are different ways in which we talk about responsibility, and it's notoriously causal, legal, moral. And for policy, I think policy is really important here. And certainly the causal responsibility, the reason why everybody got their insulin dosage wrong was because some, engineer mucked up the programming of the app that was guiding everyone in the world to do their insulin. We know who's causally responsible. I'm interested in sometimes saying that person is the appropriate target for penalties. But for policy reasons, it also, once we've admitted corporate agents to at least our legal universe, it matters to identify when they become responsible. So, I think the policy debate about responsibility, I still can't see AIs really being an appropriate, even for sort of legal responsibility or even for policy responsibility. They just can't do enough. They just can't shape their behavior in the right way. So even there, I want to resist saying that for policy reasons, we should hold the AI responsible, because what we want is human beings to change the programming of the AIs. Anyway, sorry, struggling to give a short answer, Derek. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, fine. I'm going to open the time now to the audience to raise questions and make comments. You're welcome to type in your questions in the chat box and I can pick them, or you can simply raise questions. If I do see you raise your hand, I can invite you to speak directly. We had a really rich and multi-dimensional kind of discussion here. In my mind, I'm broadly grouping them into three aspects. One is on the role and the issues of AI in making or helping or replacing doctors in decision making. Okay. One aspect is on the relations, how that AI coming in will change or influence the doctor-patient relationship or become a third party in the relationship. And thirdly, the responsibility issue, how the responsibility issues can be anticipated or dealt with the AI on that. But I'm aware that the discussion is richer than that, but broadly, I think it will be useful for audience if you raise questions to see if we can focus on some of these aspects for more discussion. Yes, so I'm letting see if any audience. We have actually a very good mix of audience here. Some really well informed and also actually working in the field in different ways, engineers, educators, and also clinicians.
Just while you're waiting for any other questions to come in, I should also have said, Daniel, thanks so much for your insights and your suggestions about the areas of philosophy that could complement and support this work. I should say I nearly started my paper with an apology to Daniel because he has seen earlier iterations of the work that's led up to this before. So I hope it was not too repetitive, but also your insights on this topic are always very, very much welcomed. So thank you for that.
It's very fun to see it develop. I recall some of our earlier sessions together. It's really fun to see the progression of our work.
Okay, before any comments come in from the audience or questions, I could possibly chip in on one of the aspects that has been discussed today, because previously in my previous role, I was working in Hospital Authority of Hong Kong, overseeing quality and safety, medical incidents, errors, and also analysis of major incidents and repeated incidents. And one of the methodologies which has evolved over time, not just in Hong Kong, but internationally, was what we call the root cause analysis method, which tries to segregate or dissect out the human aspects or human element of the error versus the systemic system procedures, technical machine design kind of issues. The idea is not to duck the human responsibility or obscure the responsibility, but rather than to learn how to prevent errors in the future. Because really the reviews of such incidents, there are two aspects. One is to assign blame and find out who's responsible, and secondly to learn how to respond and reduce the risk to doctors making mistakes in the future. So I just want to supplement that there is actually an existing methodology which in some way help us to come halfway between saying that, oh, it's not human, or we can or cannot assign something to the machine or systems. We are not actually blaming machines or the design, but certainly infusion pumps has caused lots of problems, even fatal errors because of design issues. Some infusion pumps have some sort of intelligence, even low-level intelligence, which is not always helping. I'm just making the point that we do have some experience in the organization to begin to, even if pragmatically, find a way to simultaneously address the human and non-human aspects of mistakes. That's one point that I want to supplement. And the second point I want to just remind that we have not completed the discussion as what Rob mentioned very importantly, the aspect of organization, how AI interacts with the organization, and how the organization has responsibilities to use AI appropriately, introduce it appropriately. And what I have in mind is again, my other portfolio previously was on technology assessment and introducing technology into the public hospitals in Hong Kong. And one of the perennial issues is when is a good time to introduce a technology. We want it to be fully mature, that would be too late. Introduce too early, maybe we are not sure how it will affect the system when introduced prematurely. And certainly, I think this would be a real issue for AI because it's evolving and so much uncertainty and so much potential. But the point that Sarah made about if something is really good or better than the human performance, then it seems to me that there is a sort of institutional responsibility to consider bringing it on board in some way to integrate with the present services. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it does seem to me that it seems to be a corporate, even more responsibility at the institutional level to look out for things that would have reduced human errors. And I'm thinking in mind, for instance, diagnostic radiology as a sort of checking on missing findings in the radiologist screening, because we do know that the AI now is probably as good or maybe slightly better than the average more junior radiologist, perhaps in some diagnosis. So there seems to be a moral obligation for the corporate to actively or proactively consider how to introduce AI in the appropriate time. So that's just the 2 points that I want to supplement. I noticed that Oli during in Berlin was making a point in the Oli, do you want to phrase your comment? I can read it, but do you want to phrase it here? And there's a comment by Ashley Leung. I will have time to address it. Ashley is actually a medical student in CFK. And also he is curious on the thoughts on the differences between caregiving and caring. The thoughts on whether or not, or whether or not you can certainly, I imagine the question he's getting at is, you can certainly imagine AI being part of the caregiving process. But is that actually caring for patients in the way that we commonly use the term care? I think that's the point that the Ashley was saying. But only first, let me invite you to make the comment, which you have noted in.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Very well.
Oh, very good. Great to see all of you. My idea would be to benefit from transcultural interaction in the sense that both German and Chinese philosophical contributions very often get lost in this very interesting interaction, especially when it comes to understanding of relational aspects of philosophical issues, especially in this context here. I believe that if we talk about hermeneutics in the derived sense, not talking about the meaning of the classics, but the meaning of meaning in the first place when it comes to anthropologically and ethically relevant questions of our days. I'm just suggesting that we should really put together our resources, our conceptual resources, our frameworks, our experiences. We have a huge debate that is basically it's not reflected in the common discourses now, going back to Günther Anders about the shame culture that we have initiated with the industrial design of production. So this goes back to the 1950s. And I think I'm just proposing that we're not only referring to Hans Jonas, who might be the most prominent person to represent the responsibility approach, but he's not necessarily the most relevant and interesting one when it comes to our AI discussion. So that was just my idea to bring more, cosmopolitism in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Oli. And I see that Sarah has responded to Ashley, our student's question. Sarah, you want to just briefly mention to the audience?
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure if I'd interpreted Ashley's question correctly. But if we see that there's a difference in the formalized roles of a carer versus a caregiver, then we might think that, let's say, a caregiver has a particular role in relation to the recipient of care, that might invoke additional responsibilities on top of the normal obligations of care that we have towards each other as human beings and as moral agents and moral patients. Derek, I noticed, I don't know if you can see this, I think Rob had a hand up for a while, and I just wanted to...
Yeah, sorry, I missed that. Yes, please.
Make sure I gave a word.
Yeah, please.
So originally it was just to mention the question of the gendered and racialized embodiment of robots in medical contexts. So I've recently published something called Does Robotics Have a Race Problem? Or I think that's what it's called, or Robotics Has a Race Problem, about the fact that all the robots, particularly medical robots actually, are all this kind of shiny white color. And if you care about patient responses, I think that's actually going to be very important. And was notorious examples of the gendering of healthcare robots as well. So there's resources there for your work. If you want to say, look, embodiment and relationships matter, people should be thinking about how they're representing people when they design robots. Anyway, that was my initial remark. I guess just to briefly respond to Ashley, one thing that worries me about handing over healthcare to robots is the status affirmation that's involved in having a human being care about you. Someone takes the time and they perform various ritual gestures and they affirm your importance and your role in the community and the moral significance of your suffering. I really struggle to think that we're going to get that, or we should be satisfied with a robot coming into the room. That there's a kind of expression of respect for each other when we care that is really hard to replicate with machines. It seems to me.
I fully agree there. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm now concluding our seminar today. By thanking the speakers, the discussants, and all the very rich comments and also responsive comments. May I take this occasion to inform the audience that this is the first of 3 seminars on AI and digital medicine and health and digital health. And we will have another one in July and probably another one in October. The themes that we'll be exploring will be in some way a continuation of this. The next one, we will be talking a bit more on the robotics in care, so robots and other issues. And in the third seminar, we will be exploring digital health, telemedicine, and also the professional responsibility issues. So some of these questions that we touched on today will be continued in the second and the third seminar. But let me take this occasion to again thank everyone. Very, very lovely exchange of ideas and views on this occasion. Thanks, Sarah, thanks, Rob, and Daniel, and the 2 Daniels, and all the audiences. Have a good day.